As you likely know, this is Unit Dreaming with the Historically Responsive Literacy Framework. And I didn't introduce myself very much. So my name is Maxine Alloway. I teach at the University of Washington in our elementary programs. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. But I had first heard about Gholdy Muhammad's framework in the fall. And just, it was one of those things where as soon as somebody explained it to me, I was like, oh, it put words to what I already kind of felt like I was trying to do as a teacher. And it was just such a nice framework to say, oh, that's it. That's what I try to do. So I went and I bought the book, which I have here, Cultivating Genius. I read the book, and then all of a sudden it started becoming kind of the in trendy thing. And I was talking to my husband about it last night. I was like, I almost don't want to use it anymore because it's so trendy. But I really do think that the framework is so useful. I, however, am not going to teach tonight. I'm not teaching you the book. I am not trying to be Gholdy Muhammad. I'm not telling you her words. What I want to do is share with you my interpretation, right? So, and I think that's particularly important given positionality, right? That I, as a white woman, am not going to try to represent Gholdy Muhammad, but I'm going to take her ideas and say, here's how these ideas make sense to me. Let's play with the ideas. I highly encourage you to get the book, to do some learning around the ways in which Gholdy Muhammad herself is talking about this work, because I think it is a really valuable way to think about teaching. And I love when I have all my notes and I'm like, what do I want to say? So we did our introductions. The reason that we talked about joy is that's one part of the framework that we're not going to focus in on tonight. So Gholdy Muhammad's framework kind of includes this layer of joy, that has to be at the heart of what we're doing as teachers. And one of the things that she talks about that I found really profound and had not ever really thought about was how so often we tell the narrative of oppressed communities particularly in the US. And it's the story of their oppression, right? So often when we think about Black history, we think about people that were enslaved, people, there were not a lot of, you didn't have rights, all of these things. And we forget that even when folks were enslaved, the resilience of humans were still able to find joy. And if you look at Black communities, you can see so much joy, even in the midst of terrible, awful oppression. And I started connecting it for myself as a Jewish person. The Holocaust stories are often the same narrative, and how valuable and how precious it is when somebody has candlesticks from a grandparent or a great grandparent, because in the midst of the concentration camps, people still found ways to celebrate. And so Gholdy Muhammad kind of points that out and says we have to make sure that joy is at the heart of our classroom, because throughout history, joy has been at the heart of human connections and human communities, no matter what kinds of atrocities are around them. So that's why I asked you about something that brings you joy. And here's our plan. Like I said, this is going to be a very quick introduction. In fact, if it's something you want to learn more about in the fall, we'll be offering through the University of Washington, offering kind of a longer class on thinking about Muhammad's framework. So kind of an introduction to Muhammad's framework, thinking about how do you apply that to unit planning in a way that tonight is really going to be about kind of playing and dreaming and just kind of having fun with the ideas. It's the end of the school year. You all are exhausted. Carl, I think everybody deserves lots of treating themselves. And so we're just going to kind of play with ideas tonight. And then just a chance for you to talk with one another and meet one another. So there's 3 different districts represented tonight, which is just fun, elementary schools as well as middle schools. So all of that as our goals. We're going to kind of do an overview and then get into the unit planning itself. So any burning questions? Is there anything that you want to kind of ask or get out there? that if you don't ask it now, you're going to be thinking about it and won't be able to fully focus. Any burning questions? All right.
I have a question, Maxine. I think
Thanks, Dan.
the thing that I've been sort of wrestling with, she works a lot with Bettina Love, and I'm really interested in the intersection between this and abolitionist teaching. So I'm not sure if you're going to go into that, but I'd love a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Because I know that they're partnered, and Bettina actually has the foreword in the book. So I'm just interested if you know where they're connecting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know for sure. My guess is that one of the places of connection is really centering Blackness, right? They're both thinking about how do we take the experiences of African Americans in the US and center that, center Black culture, center the history of African Americans. And so there's lots of folks out there thinking about diversity, thinking about equity, thinking about historically marginalized communities. And both of these women are really kind of focusing in on the Black experience. So my guess is that's kind of where some of the connection comes from. And they've probably, met over time, et cetera. I think, Bettina Loves writes the foreword because I think they're just coming from a lot of the same perspectives.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. It's a good question. And it's helpful to think about because some of the stories, right, growing up not in the US, you have a different understanding of US history. And that's always kind of fun to get different people who have different histories and different experiences, because you probably think about the history of African Americans in a different way. So keep asking questions. All right. I also want to give a space. I didn't do any kind of norm setting because we're together just for an hour and a half. But if there's anything that anybody feels like, here's a norm I really need for a group of people learning together. Here's something I need to feel safe and comfortable. I want to give space for you to share it either verbally or in the chat. So I'm just going to pause for a moment to give space for that. We're going to kind of start to dig into the meat of this evening. So please feel free to interrupt me at any point. We have a small group, so just stop and ask questions. You can also write in the chat. You can write to everybody. You can also write me a private message or Kendra a private message. She'll kind of monitor the chat as well. So any questions at all, please feel free to share them. So just a little bit of some background information. I already said kind of this is my interpretation, my ideas, and how I make sense of this framework. It's called the Historically Responsive Literacy Framework, or HRL. It is meant for any content area. We're going to talk about it tonight primarily in the context of literacy, but it really is kind of meant to be across the school day and across subjects. Developed by Gholdy Muhammad, who's an associate professor of literacy and literacy at Georgia State. She also is the director of the GSU, Georgia State University Urban Literacy Collaborative. And what she did, where this framework comes from, is she drew on Black literary societies of the 19th century and said what was happening in those communities, those vibrant, thriving communities. What were they valuing? What were they trying to do? What was happening? And really saw that there were 4 kind of key foci in those communities: identity, skills, intellect, and criticality. So when folks were coming together to learn to read, to write newspapers, to talk about ideas, right? In these societies, they were really focusing on all 4 of those things. And so Muhammad then asks the question, what if we were to reimagine the purposes of schooling to be aligned with the foci of these societies? So rather than thinking about the purpose of schooling as assimilation, or the purpose of schooling as preparing, after the Industrial Revolution, so much of our schooling became about preparing future workers. If you think about, if you took a history of education class in undergrad or in your teacher ed program, right? There's all these different histories of purposes, But what if the purposes were the 4 things that were key to these Black literary societies? What if we were to think about the purposes of schooling as helping kids develop their identity, helping them develop their skills, helping them develop their intellect, and helping them develop a sense of criticality? And that's kind of where this framework came from. So I'm going to talk through each of the 4 parts of the framework and then give you a chance in groups to kind of chew on it a little bit. But again, feel free to stop and ask questions at any point. So we're going to talk through each of the 4. So starting with identity. And can I have a volunteer, just so that you hear a different voice than mine? Can I have a volunteer to read what's in the purple?
I'll read what's in the purple.
Awesome. Thanks, Robin.
Do I begin?
Yep.
While historical Black communities in literary societies read and wrote text, they also defined literacy as the ability to read and write their lives.
Awesome. Thank you. So if we think of literacy as reading and writing your lives, really using literacy to and using anything that we're doing in schooling to understand yourself and understand others, who we are, who others say we are, and who we want to be. And so this is where, as teachers, you think about you're doing a writing project and you might have an all about me page. And I've always thought about the all about me page as it's a nice way to get kids to do a little extra writing. It's authentic because if you look at published books, they're often all about me, about the author pages. And so, it's nice to have an about the author page. Isn't that cute? And what this framework helps us to see is how powerful that about the author is, that it's really a chance for a student to develop their identity, to think about who they are. If they're doing a nonfiction writing, part of what they might be writing about is why they chose this topic, right? Why did they choose this animal to research? Why did they choose this topic to persuade someone? But that about the author is actually about identity, helping them develop their identity. When we have kids be metacognitive about why did you do it that way? What are you thinking about? What's important to you? What do you like about your writing? Or what do you think about yourself as a writer, as a reader, right? All of that is so valuable, not just, we want kids to feel good about themselves, but that's part of what we're doing as teachers. So what are some examples of things that you or teachers you work with do to help students learn about themselves and others? And I'm actually going to take your ideas and write them onto, I didn't mean to stop sharing. I meant to stop doing that. I'll share again in a second, but what are some examples that come to mind right away of things that you do to help kids learn about themselves or others?
So this year we actually used an identity journal that one of the teachers on my team found, and it had like a page about likes and dislikes, and a page about race, and a page about physical traits. And it was really nice because we just did 1 page a day and we'd talk about it, and kids would talk to their families about it. And it was really, I thought it went really well. The students seemed engaged and interested in it. And just reflecting with my teaching team, like none of us remember talking about race when we were in 1st grade. So we were just like, this is cool that this is, just like a norm, like race is part of your identity.
Yeah.
I'm thinking kind of off the top of my head here, thinking about what we do in the classroom, like in a routine. It's like the consistent reflection after every content area, and thinking about like what are the things that we're learning, how do we feel while we learn these things, and then kind of like sharing with one another. Was it hard? Was it difficult? Why was it difficult? Maybe you didn't really. Maybe brushing up on multiplying fractions is something that you're working on. But then also doing some community building about how we can support one another when we do feel like we struggle. But I think part of that is, I think, it's that consistent reflection opportunities throughout the day that allows students to really just think about how they feel about content and ways in which they can improve their learning.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl. And again, not only is that, that's social emotional learning, but there's something deeper there as well, that helping kids understand and learn about their own identity. Alyssa, thank you.
Hi, so in 5th grade, as I teach 5th grade, we do an identity unit with all the students. And so we start off by just making a concept web and talk about what is identity. And then the kids create another concept web, which identifies who they are. And every single day, as they learn more and more about what identity is, they would add to that concept web. And they would see by the end of the unit that what they started off with gets a lot more in depth as they go along. They just kind of discover themselves, and the kids share that with each other as well. And so they get to see, how do they relate to people that they might have not thought of that they relate to them too. So that's just one way that we do it in our classroom.
Awesome. Thank you. And I love that in when you think about what Alyssa talked about and what Carl talked about, because it really shows how these ideas and this framework kind of helps. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Really helps us think about, we can think about this framework at the every day, all the time, embedded throughout what we're doing, or this whole unit, right? A whole unit that really foregrounds identity development. And also we can do identity development as a routine, like Kate talked about. We can also do it kind of as a routine, but as something, as a thread, right? So we can use these ideas in any of those kind of ways. Let's talk about skill development. Can I have a volunteer, other than Robin, because she did last time, to read the purple? Great, thanks, Liz.
Historically, skills were cultivated because skills across areas of learning gave students, young and old alike, the access and tools for education. Page 84.
Thank you. One of the things I like about, clearly I like lots of things of this framework, but I think it's so helpful that skills is a part of it. Because I think oftentimes when we start thinking about, how do we decolonize education? How do we do things differently? Sometimes skills gets lost. Sometimes it gets kind of put aside. Well, we need to be focusing on students' identity instead. We need to be focusing on relationships instead. And what Muhammad is saying is, no, you need both and, right? We still have to think about and teach skills. That's still part of what we're doing. It's just one part. And so she's not saying ignore skills and focus on these other things. Skills is a part of it. We do skill development well, right? We don't have to spend a whole lot of time talking about skill development. If you look at the Common Core State Standards, those are the skills we're teaching. It's all skills. It's devoid of these other things, but it's very skills heavy. The skills that she's talking about are all very much about skills to construct meaning. So we're not just trying to learn to spell because we'll have to learn to spell, but because if we spell words in particular ways, it makes it easier for our readers to understand what we're trying to say. We want to learn how to decode so that we can read things and make sense of them. It's always about that constructing meaning, which then leads to joy, access, and empowerment. So what are some ways that you build skills and everybody does this one, so. Oops. Anybody have any ways they're willing to share that they build skills? And it's okay if it feels old school. Robin?
Just repetition, and just reminder, everything that I'm thinking about, and this is coming from the lens of a music teacher. Yeah, so I'm just thinking of, learning songs, just any little song that I do. I'll feel like I've done it a million times because I'll see multiple kindergarten classes. But I can do the same ones over and over and over and over again, because it's, they just need a lot of repetition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And there's comfort in that as well.
Yeah. Liz?
Really helping them use their errors to build new understanding off of errors and teaching that, you know, like using the growth mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe one more.
Explicit instruction and also explaining why they need to know that thing.
You know, there was a time in which explicit instruction kind of had a bad rep, right? It was like, oh, that's so boring, especially when you think of phonics, right? Explicit instruction of phonics, there was a time, and it's not, you know, Kate, Carl, and Caitlin, I know you don't think this, but there was a time where it was like, oh, you know, phonics it's so boring. We shouldn't really teach phonics. And then we saw, no, actually there's a time and a place for phonics. And there are lots of kids who do need phonics instruction. And so explicit instruction tied to making meaning and constructing meaning and being able to explain why. Thank you. All right, you ready for the third one? The third one is intellect development. And let's have somebody again read the purple quote.
Intellect is the understanding, enhancement, and exercising of mental powers and capacities that allow one to better understand and critique the world.
Thanks, Caitlin. So the concept of intellect, the idea that we want kids to learn stuff. In many ways, intellect is kind of the content process debate that's gone on in literacy for a long time. And I suspect if Anne had if we could see Anne, she'd be shaking her head, yes, nodding. That, you know, we've got skills, but we also teach content in literacy, right? And so intellect, what are kids learning about? And how do we help them develop that in a way that builds knowledge and curiosity, that helps kids to be intellectually stimulated and interested in what we're teaching? Again, a lot of that is kind of when you think about reading instruction in particular, what content are you doing? We're not just reading about whales because we're practicing visualizing and we're learning about text features, but we can also use this as a time to let's learn some cool stuff about whales. Let's develop our own intellect. Let's develop knowledge of things. So again, examples. And I did think we were having a slightly larger group. So the examples, thanks for sharing so much, those of you that are sharing. How do you help kids become smarter about things in the world?
One thing that we've been focusing on is text sets around content areas so that kids can read about it at different levels and access the content and build upon it. So we've been trying to build on that concept.
Yeah, that is a fantastic way to help kids to learn some stuff about something, to have different texts related to the same content, different levels, even a little bit of different genres, right? Maybe something that's more expository nonfiction, something that's more narrative nonfiction, to really let kids kind of dig into a topic is a fantastic idea. Thank you, Anne. Robin, in some ways, I don't know when you got your initial teacher search, but kind of a thematic unit, right? Some of those ideas are coming back. Alyssa, I saw that you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in addition to Anne, at our school, we're doing soul discussion groups and just giving kids the guiding question and having them do the research. And we've been throwing in some topics of recent events and things like that, and letting the kids really filter through the resources themselves and just giving them the kind of the resources and the parameters on how to do that has been really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, both of these text sets and discussion groups are particularly strong for multilingual students because then they start to develop some of the vocabulary. They start to see the same words across multiple texts because they're related to the same topic. Let's take maybe one more thing you do to help kids become smarter about things. And everybody shared. So it's totally, if you're sitting there thinking, I've already shared, you can share again. Great, thanks, Robin.
I don't know if this is already mentioned, but like taking a skill set and then putting it in a completely different scenario. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, do you want to give us a specific example if you can think of one?
Oh, you know, something as simple as, you know, formulating a 4-beat rhythm with popsicle sticks and then transferring that to, you know, notes. I mean, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
There might be lots of other little interpretations of that with their bodies, you know, turning themselves into beats and a bunch of iterations of the same thing.
Nice. Yeah. And then I think the important piece then, in addition to that application, is also, well, how is it similar? How is it different? How does it feel? And I apologize, I'm not a musician, but how does it feel different to keep the same beat on a drum than it does with the tambourine? And getting the kids to, again, develop that intellect of thinking about comparing and contrasting, to think about these different instruments. Why do you think some cultures use this and some use that, right? Which starts to get us to the next one, the next part of the framework. And we do that in literacy as well, where we've learned how to figurative language, right? We learn about figurative language maybe in poetry, where it's a little bit more prevalent. And then we're reading a narrative and we see, oh, wait, we still see some more figurative language. Why do you think authors use figurative language in both places? So really thinking about it kind of at that intellectual level, which is different than thinking about, what do you think of figurative language? Do you like reading books with figurative language or not? Which is that identity, or that, you know, what is this? I was in a classroom today where they were doing, what do different idioms mean? And they were playing a game around the meaning of different idioms, which is great. That's a skill. That's understanding. That's the skill of understanding the language, which is different than, where do you think these idioms come from? Right? So 3 different questions you can ask to hit at different parts of development. All right, let's do the last one. And I need someone to read the purple again. Kendra, will you read the purple for us?
I'd love to. As long as oppression is present in the world, students need pedagogy that nurtures criticality.
Thank you. So criticality is being used here not to just mean critical thinking, but specifically helping students develop an understanding of power, privilege, and oppression. How do we help kids to think about the world from, like, how do we help kids understand critically the power dynamics, again, power, privilege, and oppression? That's part of what we're doing as teachers. It's harder in the younger grades, right? So Kate's going to think about this a little bit differently than Carl, right? 1st grade versus 5th grade, but still able to be done, right? We want kids to be thinking about their positionality and the positionality of others. Kate was talking about the identity journals, and not only is it helping kids to think about their own racial identity, but it then also opens up some windows to help kids think about racism in the world and what it means and what it looks like, and how they can combat it. So this last piece of criticality that kind of builds on, you can see kind of why Muhammad ordered them, these 4 layers, the way that they've been layered, because it kind of all does lead to this criticality. I'm wondering if anyone feels like they do, and we've already shared a little bit, but feels like they kind of do address, there we go, it's toggling back and forth between presenter mode and not is not my favorite thing. How do you engage students in thinking about power, privilege, and oppression? And Kate, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, so will you share a little more about what have you done to help kids to talk about race?
Well, we've been using the Seattle Public Schools Ethnic Studies framework. I don't know how widely that's shared, but it covers 4 themes, starting with identity and fairness. And so we've been focusing a lot on fairness as a way to talk about power and oppression and privilege, you know, just like this, and then using real examples. Like we did talk about, what was it? It was, oh, now I'm forgetting the specific example, but something that was in the news recently it was talking about how a lot of houses and buildings in Seattle still have racist language embedded in them, but people have just ignored it and like, oh, well, we're not using that, so it doesn't matter. And so we are like looking at a map and looking at how many, you know, properties have this, and is that fair? Is that okay? You know, and so we're trying to use the real life examples, but a lot of it is, you know, like, look at this photo or read this book. What do you think about that? Is it fair?
Thanks. Thank you. Other examples? Carl, what's something I feel like teaching ELA and social studies and really honing in on that? I suspect you've been able to do a little bit of this year.
Yeah, with the difficulty of it being online, I think a lot of it is just analyzing current events. I think a lot of it within reading and social studies is giving students exposure to current events that are going on within multiple, you know, modes, of course. So thinking about videos, but also thinking about what are some really good text sets that we can give them that are at varying levels. And especially for students who might not be on a grade level, what scaffolds are we providing for them, whether that's graphic organizers, vocabulary, different text features that we can, you know, include our own, include ourselves on, like New York Times articles and things like that, just to make text more accessible for kids. But yeah, just giving them that exposure and more context to maybe some of the things that they might see on social media or on TV and what they hear from their parents.
Yeah, nice. And I'm going to put social media literacy here because, you know, especially for Liz and Alyssa and Carl as, you know, 5th grade middle school teachers, right? Kids are starting to explore and learn about social media. And so how do we help them to have that social media literacy, and not just in a like, oh, social media is bad, but how do we help them to really understand and think about it through this lens of power, privilege, and oppression. And do you all know Newsella, that website? Okay. Kate, it's harder for it. It doesn't go down to like, it kind of goes down to about 2nd grade reading level. It's harder to, even the 2nd grade, it's hard to find things. So, and
yeah,
Kate,
that's been a great resource for me.
Yeah. So again, going back to that text set idea, and you're going to get a chance to think about unit plans in just a moment, but we've got this text set, and I'm going to intentionally make sure to ask at some point after we've been looking at these different texts, which is your favorite? Why do you think that's your favorite? To hit at that identity. And we're going to be reading the texts, which are clearly going to be developing their skills. We're learning about whatever, connecting the text to one another. And then those questions of, why do you think the author wrote this? Or let's look and see the background of the authors that wrote all of these different texts. What are we noticing? Why do we think that is, right? Ways to kind of look at these books and ask these questions that hit at these different levels. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is this framework of we as teachers are trying to help kids develop across these different areas. I'm going to put us into groups, 2 rooms. So you'll be in a room with 3 or 4, with two or three other people, and for 15 minutes, and to give you a chance. I'm not going to micromanage what you're doing, but 3 different ideas, right? Get to know one another. There's some questions there. Discuss the framework. What questions do you have? What excites you? How do you see this playing out already in your classrooms? And then also take a break. And you can decide in your room if you're going to do 5 minutes for each of these 3 things, if you want to do them in a different order, how you want to do that.
I can share just a little bit. We were thinking about how the social justice standards tie in with this, and just kind of like how all these different frameworks and things we hear about, how they fit together. And then also we're talking about how, so 2 of us hadn't or don't know a lot about this framework yet, and then the 3rd does. And so, we were saying, or she was saying, that it just gets more complex the more you get into it. So up front, it's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then as you keep learning and going deeper, you're like, whoa, this is, pretty complicated.
Yeah. Thank you. Awesome. Well, let's play around with this framework a little bit in thinking about units. And you've given some fantastic examples of ways in which you already are thinking about these different levels. And so now, rather than thinking about, oh, what do you do to support this development, we're going to kind of think about it from an opposite direction and thinking about units. So as we've talked about, identity, skills, intellect, and criticality can be developed at any point in a unit. And so we talked earlier, it can be, oh, I just want to make sure I have a couple lessons that incorporate this one idea. I want to have my entire unit focused on identity development, or I'm going to take my, unit where kids were always researching a famous Black person, and instead it's going to be a person who has fought for equity, to make the whole thing about criticality, right? So you can kind of use it at the big level or at a small grain size. Obviously, curriculum's not going to point to all of these areas. The framework, as somebody mentioned, the ethnic studies curriculum in Seattle is really trying to, and I think even explicitly, incorporate Muhammad's framework. And I think they're going even further in the ethnic studies group, which looks like, I think they're focusing more on high school. I'm still a little confused, but the district is working with Gholdy Muhammad right now to develop some things. But if you think about your math curriculum, you think about the literacy curriculum, it's not going to explicitly call out how you fit in with this framework. And so that's where it really takes kind of collective creativity. So let's try it on. Think about a reading or writing unit. And Robin, if we have time, we can think about a music unit, but we're going to think literacy for now, that you teach, or that teachers that you work with teach. So again, Robin, Anne, you might know of, oh, I know that there's this unit that's happening in another classroom. And that you're teaching right now, or that you're teaching in the fall, that you'd be, and I'm wondering if there's any volunteers willing to kind of just let us play with your unit and play with thinking about how these aspects of the framework, these layers of the framework, might help us think about the unit you're teaching. So any volunteer? Carl, are you willing? I know we've got at least another 5th grade teacher, and we've got a middle school teacher, so I'm thinking 5th grade might be good.
Let's do it.
All right, will you name a unit that you, kind of an ELA unit, maybe from Making Meaning, that you teach in, that you're teaching now, or that you'll be doing in the fall?
I think I'm thinking about unit 4 fiction. I think it's unit 4, but I know it's somewhere towards the beginning of the year. Fiction, where we're supposed to be reading Tuck Everlasting, but I use an alternative text, Esperanza Rising.
Nice.
And the goal of that is to, of course, talk about all the different story elements, but I think there's a main emphasis on theme, character development, and a lot of other standards I can't think of off the top of my head, but there's a critical emphasis on on theme. Maybe I should just pull up the standards right now.
That's right. So we've got that. And are you using it from Engage? Are you using the Engage New York version of the Esperanza Rising?
Pretty much what I'm doing is I'm replacing all the pretty much like everything in CCC, same questions, same opportunities. We have to talk about character development and theme, and just pretty much swapping out. Same with the vocabulary too. We follow the CCC vocab lessons, but we pay really close attention to, are we teaching adjectives, synonyms, all that kind of stuff. So same alignment, just a totally different text.
Awesome. And there's a writing component as well. It's an integrated reading writing. Is that correct?
Yes, but we don't focus too heavily on that.
Okay, perfect. So let's just think about this as kids are learning to read fiction. We've got Esperanza Rising as a shared text that all of the kids we're kind of doing as a whole class reading, and really focusing in on theme and character development. Let's kind of play with that for a minute. Do you have any kind of culminating activity that you've historically done, Carl?
Like a diagnostic assessment of some sort?
No, is there anything at the end that you do? The kids create a presentation, or what do you do to wrap up the unit?
Yeah, so because theme is such a critical element, we think about them presenting about the theme, and then also an application to their own lives about how that theme kind of impacts their own lives. So thinking about, like, for a fondness of Pinel question, there's always that question in the later levels where you said, what does that theme, or what does that life lesson mean to you in your own life? So that's something that we kind of gravitate towards, so that students can find a lot of like personal, connection to the text and to the characters, and then also just kind of like a learning lesson moving forward.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just saying that's like one of the activities.
Awesome. I'm going to actually put that down here as the formatting of this is making me mad. I'm going to put that down here as part of the identity development, right? Is asking at the end, how does this book theme relate to your life? And I feel like that's actually a question you could ask throughout the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So even if you don't know the book, what are some things that you all can think about of how would you embed identity development in this book? Carl, can you give us a 3-sentence summary of Esperanza Rising?
Oh gosh, it's a coming of age story of a little girl named Esperanza who has come from privilege in class to the bottom, and in her process of learning about her privilege, reflecting upon it, and realizing that there's themes of like being with family is so important, that we can always start over. That's a really hard process because there's so much in the book. Thank you for that, Kendra.
Yeah, I just snagged a quick description if anybody wants to.
Thank you. I was trying to find the book is somewhere. I was like, can I find it quickly? So identity. Anybody have some thoughts? What thoughts, I think that this idea of we're always going to come back to, and do we do it every time we read? How often? But how does this book, or how does this particular theme relate to your life? I can imagine asking students to do a Venn diagram, because this is a book that's very heavy. There's a clear main character. And so a Venn diagram between Esperanza and themselves, or maybe even Esperanza themselves and someone else who's important to them. That idea of learning about yourself and others. And maybe then they do that with the book they're reading as well. And we look and we see kind of, you have so much more in common with with Harry Potter than with Esperanza? Why do you think that might be? Or why do you think you identify so much with Esperanza, but when you're choosing books with different kind of characters? Oh, you're a reader who likes to read about people different than you, right? So having kids create a Venn diagram is just one kind of, again, we're just playing with ideas, a Venn diagram of similarities and differences between self and character. Carl mentioned that one of the skills that's embedded in reading this book is vocabulary, because the kids are they're listening. It's a shared read. Most teachers, we're going to assume that Carl does it as a shared reading, where students all have a copy of the book. They can read it. They're not reading it independently because it's not going to be at everybody's independent reading level. So they're learning vocabulary as they're working through this book. That's going to be a skill that they're developing. They're developing the skill of identifying theme, the skill of unpacking characters, right? We do skill well in schools right now.
Also include like inference making in that as well.
Nice. Intellect. I've got some thoughts, but I'm curious if anybody else, if you don't know the book, it's probably hard to answer this question, but anybody other than Carl have any thoughts about how, just based on what you know of the book, what's in the description that Kendra sent, what might be things kids can get smarter about as part of reading this story?
You could explore immigration and what that means, and look for current events around immigration or where it's popping up.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where my head went as well, Kate. On immigration. Any other thoughts?
That privilege doesn't always just show up in one place.
Yeah. I'm going to put that down here.
Yeah, that there's different kinds of privilege. Yeah, I like that idea.
This book is so nice for that, because I think sometimes we give the message of like, oh, white America is privileged and everything else is not. And here it's like, no, she had a lot of privilege when she was living in Mexico. And I think that does some nice things about really thinking complexly about issues of privilege, power, class. Awesome. So kids are getting smarter about immigration. Remind me, Carl, the author, is the author themselves an immigrant?
I believe so, yeah. Pam Munoz Ryan. Yes.
Yeah, I believe she is as well. So there's another place where we can get smarter. You know, we're thinking about fiction. How do you think the author came up with this idea? What might have happened in her life to give her these ideas? That would be kind of part of that intellect. Any other thoughts about, hold on, sorry. Can't do this quickly. We'll just see what happens. Let's see. Yeah, we're like just on the brink of time. What I had wanted us to do was to think about, I'm listening to see, I may need to step away for 1 second again. I apologize. This is the downside of, you know, teaching from your house. So I'm going to step aside for a minute. Think about if there's any other places, and actually I'm going to empower you to add to the PowerPoint. I'm going to stop. Thanks, Kendra. I'm going to stop sharing. And if you want to add anything to the PowerPoint of ideas you have of how else you could embed these different layers in a unit on Esperanza, and I'll be back in just one moment.
I really like how that was just laid out like that.
Yeah.
It was like, no, I was thinking unit planning and I got nervous. I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna be going down that rabbit hole. But I like how those lenses, really, like, you could do that with every topic in your curriculum map, just putting in those things. I know that when I did language arts in high school, I'm middle school now, and now I'm co-teaching science. They kind of throw me wherever. And I remember a lot of what was perspective taking and really picking and a lot of student voice and choosing authors and just figuring out how to build a unit around those concepts. I like that.
Mhm.
That's cool.
Sorry about that. All right. Well, we of course are, oh, got their ideas, I forgot. I had hoped that we'd get a chance to do kind of a guided practice, if you will, of trying this on. But hopefully your juices are flowing enough that you could do the same idea, that you could take a unit and then think through, okay, what are the big ideas? And then what are some ways I could embed identity development, skill development, intellect, and criticality in, and I'm probably already doing it, but if I know that I'm doing it and I do it intentionally, it sticks better, right? So when you run out of time, when something happens and you have to make decisions, I think that one of my big takeaways for you all is if you do this intentionally, then you don't default to just teaching skills when things get hard. And next school year will not be nearly as hard as this school year, but to really be able to hold on to and say, no, I'm doing all four of these things. And I'm going to make sure to give attention to all four of them across my school day, across a month, across the year.